Alright, hello everyone. Today for our lesson we have our new topic for Tuesday. Today it's the geography of ancient Egypt, as we always do. And as you know, we start our new units with the geography. So in order to understand a place, you must understand where it's located and how the geography affects that place. And so we'll get right into that. So the big picture here. To understand about geography, much like with the Fertile Crescent and Sumer and those two important rivers that provided life to the region of Mesopotamia, in Egypt, people began farming. They began farming villages in the Nile River Valley in Africa. So we're in the continent of Africa. Mesopotamia was in Asia, same region, the Middle East. But people began their farming villages in the Nile River Valley. And the land near the river was so lush, which means fertile, and you know what fertile is based on previous lessons, good for growing. It was so lush and green and fertile because of that flooding, just the same exact way that we know that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia would flood. They would leave these deposits of silt, and you know silt was a vocab word. It's tiny rocks and basically fertile soil that gets deposited from the bottom of the river when it overflows onto the land. It goes into the farm fields. It deposits the silt and the water. And by depositing both of those, it's natural irrigation, all vocab terms that we've talked about. So the big picture, the big idea is that farming's possible in ancient Egypt, which is entirely a desert, except for the fact that these natural floods happened on a yearly basis when it was time for farming to happen from the Nile River. The Nile provides life. If we zoom out, when we talked about the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, it was all here where my cursor is going over, and currently in modern-day Iraq, the capital of Baghdad there. But these were the Tigris Euphrates. They flowed here into the Persian Gulf. Now, Egypt, same region of the Middle East, this whole same area, but Egypt's here, and the river flows in a specific direction. It doesn't defy gravity, but it flows north. It's the only river in the world that does so. We'll talk about that more today. Most rivers in the world will flow this way, south. Okay? And so it flows north because of where the headwaters start. Down here in East Africa, we'll discuss that in just a moment. It's important to know that when we really zoom in on Egypt, you have, it's called the Great Sand Sea, or the Libyan Desert over here. You have desert on this side of Egypt, and you have the Sinai Peninsula, which is largely sandy desert. This entire region of North Africa here is the part of the Sahara Desert, and the Libyan Desert on the western side of the country of Egypt, where Libya is. Libyan Desert is just a small piece of this larger Saharan desert. And so when you really zoom in on ancient Egypt, you have the body of sea of the Mediterranean to the top, in the north of Egypt. To the east, you have the Red Sea, and you have the Nile River flowing north. Okay? And then the countries of Israel border the Sinai Peninsula here. And you have the nations on the west of Libya, as I just said, where the Libyan Desert is, and to the south is Sudan. So the Nile River is referred to as the gift of the Nile because it provides life. The Nile was referred to as the gift since it flooded and created land for farming. Without that land for farming, because of those floods, if this snaky river right here didn't exist, this would be a dead land. It would just be absolute dead desert with an oasis here and there. There would be no civilization. There would be no country there today. It would probably just be a part of a larger country that had a big old bunch of sand, bunch of desert. There's nothing there that's redeemable in ancient in the country of Egypt, except for what is on the left and the right, or the east and the west side of this river in the Nile River Delta here to the north. So the Nile River is the world's longest river. It's 4,132 miles long, And as you saw on the map, it flows from East Africa north and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. So when we zoom out, it flows from East Africa down here where its headwaters begin. It flows north through Sudan and then through all of Egypt and dumps out and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. The rainy season, which allows for water to be replenished in that river, lasts from May until September, and that's what causes the Nile River to flood. And thank God again that it does, because otherwise there'd be no way for farming and agriculture and therefore civilization to exist at any time in Egyptian history if it didn't have this water, this fresh water source. And these floods make farming possible, but they can also create great damage. If they overflow too much, they can go into villages and towns. It can destroy homes. It can destroy other things that are there. Livestock can get swept away. It's also dangerous if it doesn't flood, or the rainy season's not a very wet one, and then these floods are not very effective. It doesn't flood at all, or it doesn't flood like it usually does on a consistent basis, and that does happen when there's a drought. And then that means that it affects farming, and then that can create a lot of damage, because if you can't farm, you can't grow your surplus. If you can't grow your surplus, then you do not have food to last you throughout the year, and therefore a population cannot sustain itself. So really, the rainy season happens in this region, in East Africa, and these are highlands over here in Ethiopia, and then the water will flow north, and that's when the floods occur here in Egypt, and that's why farming is possible on the sides, on the banks of the Nile River. And when you zoom in on that, you see the Nile floods this way. It flows north, and on the western side, the western banks, and the eastern banks of that river, you will have your farming possible. But way out here, desert, no farming possible. Down here, no farming possible, even along the coastline. Here in the Sinai Peninsula, no farming possible. And as we move on to our last slide for today, so this right here is supposed to be showing you what a delta is. The formatting got a little messed up, I apologize. So the gift of the Nile. Near the Mediterranean Sea, the river branches, okay, it branches off, forming, a vocab word for you, a delta, a triangle-shaped area of land. So I'll move up to the map and show you. This is the delta right here, sort of a triangle, okay? And that delta is formed when the river is flowing out into the Mediterranean Sea. But the area of land that it flows through before it hits that large body of water is very fertile. It's extremely fertile because of the silt that is left behind. So it's sort of like the water of the Nile flows into the Mediterranean Sea, but a lot of that silt gets stuck right here, and it's the most fertile area in Egypt, ancient Egypt or modern Egypt. This is that triangle, that delta. The water continues flowing out, but a lot of that silt gets left behind, just as it would overflow on the riverbanks and leave that silt here. It also is going to leave a large deposits of that silt here, so it's great for farming. The Nile Delta region is located in North Egypt. It's actually called Upper and Lower Egypt. If you refer to the map, if you kind of draw an imaginary line right across where the name Egypt is, the country's name, north of that line up here is called Lower Egypt, which is weird and confusing if you didn't know, because it's the northern part of the country is called Lower right here. It says Lower Egypt, and the southern part of the country is called Upper Egypt, and that is entirely to do with the direction that the Nile River flows, which is north. Because it floats north, this is where it empties out. It's the lower portion of Egypt, the lower portion of the Nile River. This is the upper portion of the Nile River. And ancient Egypt was split at one time that way. So it can be confusing if you don't realize and remember that it's because this 4,132-mile river flows north. Okay, the delta seems to be higher up on the map. Higher meaning up here because it's flowing this way. Usually it would be down here. But because of the direction of the river flowing north, I'm going to say that a few times because it's really important. And that's why you have this area where the delta is called Lower Egypt, which is higher on the map, and Upper Egypt is in the south of Egypt. It's lower on the map, so it's definitely reversed. So what we've learned here is that the first farming villages began because the Nile River provided life to this desert region. The land along the river is lush and fertile and good for farming and agriculture because of that natural flooding and irrigation. And we know through Mesopotamia and farming that it leaves deposits of silt, which is good for farming. We know that it's called the gift of the Nile because it's a place that would be inhospitable to human beings to grow anything in the Sahara Desert, but the flow of that river allows it. It flows from the highlands of East Africa, specifically in Ethiopia, north and empties out into the Mediterranean Sea. And we know that this area to the north is called a delta, and it has a great deal of fertile land there because of the silt that's left behind as the water continues gushing out into the Mediterranean Sea because it flows north this way. Okay? And most important to take away, aside from the flowing direction of the river and what it provides the people of ancient Egypt and modern Egypt today, is that the northern half of Egypt is Lower Egypt, and the southern half is Upper Egypt, and that's because of the reverse flow of the river itself.